Right. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Lindsay Wong, and I am an author and assistant professor of creative writing in the English department at the University of Winnipeg. I'm a Chinese woman with purple hair, and I want to welcome you to our second event for a publishing speaker series. And today we are featuring a reading and Q&A with award-winning author Shashi Bhat. Today's event will be recorded, so if you do not want to be on camera, please keep your video off. We also ask that you keep your mics muted. We have a lot of questions submitted already, so we will only turn to chat if there is time. And I want to thank the English department and the research office at the University of Winnipeg for super support of this event. Today, we also acknowledge that we live and work in the territories of the Shinabog, Cree, Dakota, Dene, Métis, and Oji Cree nations. The University of Winnipeg sits in Treaty 1 territory, the ancestral and traditional homeland of Anishinaabe peoples. As a settler of color writer, I am not only committed to honoring and following the lead of the land, water, and cultural protectors of this space, but I also am a constant and forever student of the remarkable stories and tellings by Indigenous peoples here and around the world. So thank you for this space, and I'm very grateful to all of you for joining us today. So I'm very excited to welcome Shashi Bhat, who is the author of the forthcoming short story collection, Death by a Thousand Cuts, and the novels, The Most Precious Substance on Earth, a finalist for the 2022 Governor General's Award for Fiction. For those of you who don't know, that's a really big deal. And The Family Took Shape, a finalist for the Thomas Rattle Atlantic Fiction Award. Her fiction has won the Writers' Trust McClellan and Stewart Journey Prize and has been shortlisted for a National Magazine Award and the RBC Bronwyn Wallace Award for Emerging Writers, and appeared in such publications as The Fiddlehead, the Malahat Review, Best Canadian Stories, and the Journey Prize Stories. Shashi holds an MFA from the Johns Hopkins University and a BA from Cornell University. She lives in New Westminster, BC, where she's the editor-in-chief of Event Magazine and teaches creative writing at Douglas College. So thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks
so
for
excited.
having me. Yeah,
Thank
I'm
you.
honored to be here. I thought I would start just with a short reading from, it sounds like the story that your class read last week. So it's the title story, The Most Precious Substance on Earth. And I'm just going to read from the opening. It's, I think, about 6 minutes long. We are on our way to Bandfest and we are going to win. Everyone can feel it. On the airplane from Halifax to Toronto, the band has a hive mind. We're humming an electric rendition of the first suite in E-flat, the woodwinds tooting out in forceful staccato as we begin the second movement. Brass players purse their lips to air trumpets, extend the slides of air trombones. Bandmates in the adjacent row thrum on their trays. I wet my mouth in preparation for my elegiac solo. Stop, 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 guys, says Mr. Rees, the conductor, undoing his seatbelt and standing up in his seat. You're disturbing the other passengers. The other passengers look down at their in-flight reading material as he says this. He puts his hands on his bony hips and scans the rows for culprits. Remember, you're representing the band. Musicianship is more than talent. The last bit is a direct quote from Mr. Rees' Rules of Conduct for Band, hand-printed in marker on chart paper and pinned up at the front of the band room back at school. At the start of the year, he handed out typed copies and made us all sign and return them. Earlier this morning, the ratio of parents to band members at the Halifax airport was nearly 2-to-1. My mom befriended and exchanged numbers with the other two Indian moms, while my dad struck up conversations with the teachers, questioning them about the trip's educational objectives and confirming for the second time that boys and girls would be staying in separate areas of the hotel. Corinne, who usually wears raver pants, was today not wearing raver pants. She was the first of my roommates to arrive. Tearaways, I said, gesturing at her athletic wear. Jeans, she said, gesturing at my jeans. We don't know each other that well. It was a revelation to learn that everyone in her family, including a hyperactive younger brother, has the same dark bowl cut. Corinne's hair is the color of lilacs and assumes a new shape every day. It's currently a triangle, like the hair of that lady from Dilbert. Around us, band members were flapping their boarding passes and imitating the bad French accent of the voice making announcements over the loudspeaker. Mr. Rees shouted over them, "Decorum, folks." The other two chaperones, female teachers he presumably invited so he didn't have to share a room, herded us out of the way of travelers taking advantage of cheap May flights. Then they exchanged eye contact as if silently agreeing to never have children of their own. I wasn't sure if Amy would make it in time to catch the flight, though I knew she had paid the trip fees. Her punctuality had been in constant decline, and she'd missed the last few rehearsals. Just before the teachers guided us to security, Amy rolled in with a crimson suitcase, shiny and hard like it was candy coated. Her mother waved at me without smiling and then headed over to Clearwater to buy a live packaged lobster. Eunice, our fourth roommate, wandered in bewildered, eyes staring up at the signs listing departure gates until she finally saw us. Eunice's parents were the only ones who didn't bother parking. They just dropped her off outside and sped away back to their house in Dartmouth, aka the Dark Side, a city that had blighted its waterfront with a power plant and refinery. "I've never been on an airplane before," she said. From her expression, I doubted she'd been to the airport before either. When the families left, it was just the 43 of us in identical green band sweaters with a petite white treble clef embroidered on the right breast, a teenage forest in the airport lobby. When we don our sweaters, it's like on Captain Planet when the five teens shoot laser beams out of the magical rings they wear, combining their powers to summon up Captain Planet from wherever he usually hangs out. I never watched that show, so I don't know what happens after that. But with the Platinum Band, it's like we morph into an unstoppable force of concert band music. The Platinum Band was originally called the Gold Band, but then Mr. Rees took over as conductor and explained to us that platinum was the most precious substance on Earth. This is false. A French horn player looked it up. One morning before rehearsal started, he got a percussionist to do a drum roll and then announced to us that platinum is surpassed in value by 12 other substances, including diamonds, rhino horns, and meth. "Why not the rhino horn band?" demanded the French horn player, but Mr. Rees took it as rhetorical. And I think I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thanks. That was just so good. And I am such a huge fan of the book, as you know, and I always think of it as short stories because we've talked about it. And I know like when I see like, oh, it's a novel, I'm like, oh yeah, it's actually they wanted it to be a novel. So it's
Oh,
really
thank you.
just yeah, it's such a, singular work and it's so funny and witty and your trademark
Thanks.
style.
You're far too generous.
No, it's true though. Ask anyone. We were I was at this dinner and people brought it up. Um,
Oh,
just the
really?
way,
Wow. I'm like, what dinner was this?
yeah, I was people were just saying that they loved your work. And
Oh,
then I
that's
was
really
like
nice.
saying like your short story collection's coming out soon. But yeah, I'm just gonna, I guess, like jump in and before we and get to some general craft questions. So we've read your story, and as I mentioned, you are acclaimed an award-winning short story writer, and you are just so it's just so your work is just so contemporary and just beautifully crafted. And I think like as I was at that writers' dinner, people were saying, you're like one of the best short story writers working today, with our peers and everyone. Um, can you maybe talk a little bit about your trajectory to becoming a published writer and what draws you to the form of short fiction?
Yeah, thank you. I'm just like glowing under all of this praise. So my trajectory to becoming a published writer, I always read a lot and wrote a lot growing up, like just for fun. And it was always primarily short fiction. Like I was never one of those kids who was working on a novel. I was always writing short stories, which is maybe a bit weird. Um, I don't think I started writing seriously until undergrad. And I was an English major, but I was also pre-med. And my plan was to go to medical school. And I was in my last year of undergrad, and I was like studying for the MCATs and had asked my professors for med school recommendation letters and was working on applications and I just like couldn't see myself doing it. So I instead applied to MFAs in creative writing. My parents were like greatly displeased. And then I think it was in grad school that I started sending stuff out and actually like trying to get published. And it was all just short stories to literary magazines. And short stories were also my path to being published in book form. So like my first book, I found my publisher because I was like a finalist for the Bronwyn Wallace Award, which is for short stories. And also poetry. And a friend of my editor's was at the readings for that event, and just asked me if I had a manuscript, or told my editor to ask me if I had a manuscript. And I was just lucky timing wise that I had one. And then for this book, the Most Precious Substance, I was up for the Journey Prize, and an agent reached out for me, and kind of the same thing, asked if I had a manuscript. I was almost done, so I just kind of polished it up, sent it to her, and she sold it to my current publisher for that book and the short story collection too. And I feel like the way I said that was really like makes it sound like it happened really fast and easily, but that was like over 15 years and involved a lot of work and failure and also luck and timing. So I don't want to make it sound like it was easy. It was like terrible and difficult. Um, and oh, the second part of your question was about why the short story. So I think there are like three things that I love about the short story form. One is just how it compresses and showcases the narrative arc and how there can be such a pronounced rising action in a short story. The second one is this potential for a gut punch ending. Like with my own fiction classes, we talk about how short story arcs are often truncated, like they end right after the climax, instead of like in a novel where you see this falling action and resolution and so on. And I just think that creates that opportunity to leave the reader with this like just feeling in their stomach, or the gut punch. And then the third thing I love about the short story is the tendency towards omission, and how it matters as much what is left off the page as what's on it, and how as a result everything that's left has to be doing so much more work and has to be in balance. And I thought I would share the analogy that my editor of my first book told me. It was like the first time we met at a Starbucks, and he told me that a story has to be like a pile of sticks. And he took a bunch of these Starbucks like wooden stir sticks and he held them up like this. I'm just using pens to demonstrate. And he said, a story has to be like a pile of sticks standing vertically, where if you remove one of them, all the rest of them collapse. And I just really love that idea that everything is kind of hanging together in balance and everything is essential.
That's like a great metaphor, like a bunch of sticks, because if one thing is out of, I guess, out of position, the story just falls, right? Because it's like a really, it's like a fine balancing act, and so hard to do, right?
Yeah, and it's kind of fun to search for, like, I think my favorite part of the editing process is looking for things that I can cut and it doesn't really affect the rest of the story.
That's the hardest part for me, because I think I'm more of a novelist in that I'm just like everything's on the page, right? And then cutting
Yeah.
is, it's just so hard just to find out like how do I keep this arc but also tell a really sustaining short story.
Mhm.
But you do it so well. And I just wanted to like go back to the idea you said, 15 years, and it was like really, really, I guess, a lot of like sending work out and then the rejection process. And I know like I think
Mhm.
students are always hesitant to send their work out. So the Bronwyn Wallace, right? That's a competition open to anyone in Canada, and it's you get great exposure. Before that, were you sending it out to literary magazines, school journals?
I was, yeah, literary magazines, like pretty much anywhere. I would look at the classified section in Poets and Writers magazine. I was living in the US at the time, so was focused more on US magazines. And then when I moved back to Canada, I did more Canadian submissions. Yeah, I also did a lot of querying before I published my first book, and I didn't have an agent for that book, but it was like a lot of rejections to queries.
Mhm. Yeah. Like a writer, we were just talking about rejections before you all came on. And, even as, published, successful writers, we get rejections all the time. So it's really just about, oh, you just keep going.
Yeah, just part of the process.
Mhm. Thank you for that. Um, so having written two highly acclaimed books and you have another one on the way, could you discuss your metamorphosis as a fiction writer? And do you view your creative process differently now in comparison to your first book? Everyone knows this, but I always say in writing, I want to like gouge out my eyeballs. I've joked about this a lot. So what is it like for you?
Yeah, I think this is a really good question. Like for me, I think my craft definitely has changed, and it's mostly as a result of a change in the way I think about audience. Like when I was writing, before I had published anything, I just like the idea of people actually reading it didn't seem real, so I wasn't really thinking about audience. So what I wrote was very self-indulgent. Like I wrote these long descriptions, like I just described everything. I was also writing in a way, it's funny because I wasn't thinking about audience, but I was still writing towards expectations towards South Asian writers. And a lot of what I had seen published was like family generational sagas with a lot of like cultural details. And that was the kind of stuff I was writing. I had an experience in grad school that I think really changed the way I think about audience, where our cohort put on these readings at a bar off campus called The Den, and it was like the seediest bar you can imagine, like dimly lit. And there were actually like a bunch of beds across, like along one wall where people would sit. So just like a generally gross environment. But the audience was all our pre-med students at Johns Hopkins who didn't read fiction, and I knew they weren't gonna want to hear my like slow descriptive stories about South Asian culture. Um, so I started writing these stories that were like aimed at that specific audience, where I tried to make them more accessible and funny, and they had like jokes in them and pop culture references, and then also thinking about like how do I create some kind of turn or get a reaction out of people. So I think that's been the biggest like change in my work, is I think more concretely about audience and like what's going to get a reaction, where is their attention going to lag? How do I maintain momentum? Yeah, so just audience, and I think that has impacted a lot of those craft choices.
Mhm. Yeah, I think about that a lot too, right? Because my first book, you're just writing for yourself because you have no
Mm.
expectation of publication. You have no expectation of anyone wanting to read it. And then once you become a published author, you realize that every sentence, every word is going to be scrutinized, right?
Mhm.
And so I don't know, is it more terrifying to think of audience when you're writing, or is it something that we should just ignore and pretend we're writing for ourselves?
It like I think there's two ways to think about audience, and I think like one is helpful and one isn't. Like for me, I like to think of an ideal reader, or like who is the perfect audience for my work. And I think of like my friend Jackie, who is like my for some reason my ideal audience, and also my now my editor Anita. And so I do find it helpful to think about like would they think this joke was funny, or like what reaction would they get? But I think what's not helpful to me is thinking about like Goodreads reviews, like that kind of audience, or like prospective agents and editors, and yeah, because that's just stressful.
Well, that's good advice. Your ideal audience, your ideal reader. How has your relationship to language, imagery, and narrative structure evolved?
To language, imagery, and narrative structure. Yeah, I think again, it's that like thinking about audience and now, like I think I used to write more kind of meandering, observant, quiet stories. And like actually when I was submitting my first book to agents for like querying to agents, a lot of the rejections I got, it was like there's nothing wrong with the book, but they would say it was too quiet. And it's like, oh, you have to write louder. So I think that's one thing I think about more now, like in terms of narrative structure and having a real clear arc. And also like even things like I had a professor in undergrad who would say you should always be thinking about what you want the reader to feel in the white. And he meant like the white space at the bottom of the page once the story is over. So that's something I find really helpful and that I think a lot about now is like what are you asking the reader to sit with?
Yeah. It's almost like writing is like it's a dialogue with a stranger that you may or may not meet. And I think that's
Yeah.
so interesting, right? It's so different when we, tweet or write something online, right? It goes to like, multiples of strangers that we'll never see. But when you're writing, it's like the ideal reader, right? And you hope that person's just gonna get your work and love it. Yeah. Don't get
Yeah.
started on Goodreads.
Yeah, and I think it's helpful to think about the fact that you're like even though you're when you write you're alone at your computer or whatever, it's still communication, like you're still trying to communicate an idea to other people.
Mhm. And you're your cat helper.
Oh, what was
Your
it?
cat, you have your cat helper,
Oh
like
yeah,
take photos on Instagram with your cat.
she's usually in here. I think she's in the other room right now. I might have closed the door so she can't get in.
We're a pet class, so a lot of people have pets.
Oh, nice.
Yeah.
I would have brought her.
So in your interviews, you mentioned Laurie Moore and ZZ Packer as being literary inspirations.
Yeah.
So in my workshops, we always talk about literary genealogy because we don't write in a vacuum, even though we like to think so. Um, I'm wondering if you might discuss how some of these literary grandparents or cousins or aunties or siblings, I guess, help shape your latest work.
Yeah. I think like growing up I read a lot of short stories. It's interesting how the demographics of the people I read has changed. um like growing up I did read a lot of white male writers because that's what we were assigned in school. Like I was a huge Kurt Vonnegut fan and still am. And like I could see that reading his short stories he has that like blend of humor and humanity where it like seems like one thing on the surface but there's actually something much deeper there, and that's the kind of writing that I've always been drawn to and that I think has really influenced me. And then in college I encountered you mentioned ZZ Packer. I feel like reading her short story collection was just really impactful, because she was writing in a way where like I read a few of her stories and like hadn't realized that you could write that way where it's just so contemporary and irreverent and didn't feel like serious literature, but then it is serious. Like it's about so much more than that. I think the other kinds of writing that had a big influence were like short stories that had powerful endings. So stories like Amy Hempel's in the cemetery where Al Jolson is buried, where it's ending, it's just like devastating. Or Tobias Wolff's Bullet in the Brain. Like that story, at one point I memorized the ending. Like I just read it over and over and would recite it to myself so that I could like feel its rhythms and like almost absorb it as if I could like steal its powers or something. Yeah, there's probably more that I'm forgetting, but I think those are the main ones. And yeah, that's mostly that blend of humor, humanity, or emotional depth, and those powerful endings.
Yeah, and I think that's what the best short stories are. Right? They don't take themselves too seriously, but when you stop and think about it, you're just like, oh, I understand it now. Right?
Yeah, or like I didn't see it coming.
Yeah, exactly. Right. That surprise. Thank you. So last week, we read and we discussed the most precious substance on earth, and many students they resonated with Nina. and they also really sympathized with poor Eunice. And then some students were actually frustrated by Nina's inactiveness, right?
Mm.
Especially when Eunice is getting bullied. So, how would you characterize Nina as a narrator, and what brought you as an author to these choices?
Yeah, I think Nina is a fairly passive protagonist, especially in that story. Like, I think less so in other parts of the novel. And I think it's like you're supposed to feel like, why isn't she saying anything, or why isn't anyone saying anything in this terrible situation. Nina, especially in this story, like tends to disappear into the group, whether it's the group of the four girls or in the larger group of the band. And I think like in that moment in the story where they're in the hotel room and there's that kind of confrontation, I think in Nina's inaction, she's still making a choice, and it's still a choice that has consequences for her. Like she gets kicked out of the band. Um, I I guess like for that character and that voice and where she came from, like I mentioned those readings that I did in grad school at that bar called the Den, and the first chapter of this book was written as one of those readings or for one of those readings. And I thought like, okay, I'll write a story from the voice of a 14-year-old girl because it'll be fun and kind of nostalgic and funny and accessible. So initially I just chose that voice for that audience. But then in writing that story, I had to think about like why this voice and why this voice for this particular story. Like, why is it crucial that this voice tells this story? And I think the voices of 14-year-old girls or young girls in general, like we're used to seeing them in young adult fiction, in works that are often easily dismissed and where everything turns out okay. And I think even in adult fiction, the voices of young girls are taken less seriously and they're not counted as like, quote, literary. So I think a voice like that builds some expectations in the reader, and I wanted to experiment with those expectations. I knew that at some point I wanted the story to pull the rug out from under the reader, and for a story that initially seemed light and funny to become dark and unexpected, and like uncomfortably real. And that was something I tried to do with each of the stories in the first half of the book when the narrator is a teenager. So just kind of playing with that voice and with thwarted expectations. And my intention was for that kind of like light, irreverent, goofy voice to belie the seriousness of what these young girls are experiencing in their lives. But I think the voice mattered, like partly for holding audience attention, but also in terms of narrative shape, like setting up an expectation and then thwarting that expectation.
Mhm. And I think it works so well because there's that lightness, right, of Nina, and it's like it's almost like your best friend from high school is talking to you through the whole book, right? And that's what makes it so appealing and engaging, I think, to a lot of people.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was kind of my intent, like for it to feel like something light and then to kind of shift in a way towards something darker.
Yeah. And I think there's like I think there's also that danger, right, of writing younger narrators. People just assume it's YA and it's not, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I still sometimes see people describing it as YA, or like I'm like, no, it's really not. She's an adult in the second half of the book also.
Exactly. Um, and we're going back to voice because we're going to be talking about voice for the next couple of weeks. So
Oh,
during the
cool.
crafting process, does the character's voice come before the narrative voice, or do you explore it at the same time? And how do you really find the right voice for each story? Um,
Yeah, I think it so depends on the story. Like for that story, it was all about audience and kind of like playing with expectations. And I think that is probably my favorite kind of voice to write is like a kind of funny voice. And that's why I really like writing in first person. Like I think in third person it's harder to do that. And I do write in third person sometimes, but those stories tend to be more serious. Yeah. So I think it just matters, or like the way I choose the voice depends on the specific story.
Yeah, because I noticed in your new book that's coming out, it was more first person, and then you saved the third person for some of like the darker stories.
Yeah, that's interesting. I even have a second person story, and I know second
Mhm.
person can be off-putting, so I kind of like hid it in the middle so people would get used to the book first before I threw second person at them.
Yeah. I always find second person really interesting to read.
Yeah, I like second person. I know my students all find it off-putting. So
Interesting. Yeah. I have them write second person sometimes, and I find people um it sometimes can feel like a choose your own adventure story, right? So
yeah.
it's hard to do for like a long period of time.
Yeah, my students always think they don't like it, and then when they write it, they say it was easier than they thought. So I think it's kind of fun to experiment with.
Mhm. For sure. So another interesting question that was brought up in class had to deal with writing unlikable characters and this notion of unkindness as the
Yeah.
underlying motif. And that's something I also grapple with in my own writing because I also
Hmm.
really like complex, narrators, or maybe it's because it's a generational thing. We're both millennials, and I think apparently we have a very dark sense of humor, according to Gen Z. I see it on TikTok. So, are there any advantages to writing unlikable characters? And do you think female authors of color tend to get more pushback about having unlikable narrators than their white male counterparts?
Yeah, that's such an interesting question. I
It's a
just
big
find,
question.
yeah, but I find cruelty interesting, like interesting to think about and to write about. I think all of my books like address or explore cruelty in some way. And like unlikable characters can be so much fun to write, especially when you have this opportunity to like have a character who says and does things that you wouldn't. I think it can be really freeing. And like in this book, I have a character in the like second half of the book named Dave, who's just like awful. And he's like buffoonishly sexist and racist in a kind of oblivious way that I'm sure we've all seen, where he just totally lacks self-awareness. But I've also definitely met people like that. Like and I think that was the part that I found an interesting challenge about writing that character is like, how do I keep this character from sounding like a cartoon? How do I make it feel like a real person that we might encounter while also making him like quite unlikable? Um, I think along those lines, like when I'm writing, I don't like I don't like to think about it in terms of likable and unlikable, although I think readers do think about it that way. I like to think like, how do I make this character human and how do I make them complicated and flawed? And also, I think a wholly likable character can be pretty boring and unrealistic. Like personally, I face a lot of petty ethical dilemmas on a daily basis. I'm constantly saying the wrong thing and then spending days ruminating about it. So I'm just like, why wouldn't I have my characters be the same way? Um, as for that part of the question about whether like women of color are under expectations to write likable characters, I do hear that. Like that does seem to be true. And like nobody's complaining that Walter White is unsympathetic. We know that he serves a purpose within that story. Like he serves a function. He's like unlikable for a reason. I kind of wonder if that expectation of likable characters falls on women in general. It's like how women are expected to like um, be pretty and nice and to smile. It's like they transfer those expectations onto our protagonists too. Um, I know well in this book a couple of my characters like most notably Nina and Eunice are victims of abuse, and then even the character of Amy, like you see in other parts of the book that she's going through a lot of struggles in her home life, like she is herself a victim in some ways. But all of those characters are all unlikable at various points. And I kind of wonder if like how much of people wanting those characters to be likable is about wanting them to be ideal victims, as though we can't sympathize with them unless they're perfect. I do think it's changing though. I don't know if you feel this way too, but I like in your own work, for example, like we do see examples of a greater variety of ways that women and women of color are depicted. Or I was thinking of a couple of books I've read recently, like Sheena Patel's I'm a Fan, where it's this woman who's just like obsessed with a guy that she's involved with, and it's this horribly toxic relationship, and she's stalking him on Instagram, and she's pretty unlikable throughout the whole book, but a super compelling character. Or like Raven Leilani's Luster, where protagonist is a woman of color. She's also like pretty much a mess. And I think like toes that line between likable and unlikable. Yeah, but I guess in general, I wonder like isn't that what fiction is for, to explore that full range of human behavior? And it would feel so limiting to write only likable characters, limiting and boring.
Hmm. I agree. There's so much to do, right? If someone is unlikable, right? In that sense, right? You can do all sorts of things in fiction that you can't do in real life, right?
Yeah, that's the joy
Yeah,
of fiction.
exactly. Hmm. Is there an expectation, I guess, for women of color to write about certain subjects and follow cultural narratives in order to be successful in mainstream publishing? Um, that's something I'm always really interested in. I've not really felt it, but I see that, as women of color, like writing, coming from like a memoir background, there is that expectation to want to write about immigration and your family, right?
Yeah,
But I don't know so much in fiction. I don't know if you've experienced that.
I have felt a bit of that, or the some. I think when I like 10 years ago, maybe with my first book, I got a lot of like feedback, like make it more South Asian because that's what
Mhm.
sets you apart. Now not so much, but I do still get the assumption that like people who haven't read my book assume that I wrote about immigration, and like I'm not even an immigrant. I'm from Toronto. And like I've been at festivals where they put me on a panel about like immigrant fiction, or and I'm like, I really am not an authority on this. Like there are better people that you could ask to be on this panel. Yeah, so it's interesting that people assume that that's the only thing we can write about.
Mhm. Exactly. They always assume immigration, family, domestic topics, right? It's always.
Yeah, and it's not like there's anything wrong with writing about those things, but there's so much other stuff that you can also write about.
Mhm. Exactly. So moving on again to, I guess, back to the most precious substance on earth. In an interview, you mentioned that you wanted, each ending, right, to feel like a lump in the throat. And you talked about it a little bit about that feeling of building discomfort, right? And how, the narrator feels because they're like consistently uncomfortable. And you do, successfully sustain it throughout each story. And I think that at the end, we feel that huge gut punch, right? When you're building up that suspense with Eunice and the bullying and Amy. Um,
Mm.
can you talk a bit about how you structured that particular scene and how you were able to build up that narrative momentum?
Yeah, I really like this question because I feel like I have a concrete, like specific answer for it. So that section, like the rising action build up section, I structured it as like a series of questions that Amy asks, leading to the reveal of Eunice's trauma. And the inspiration for that scene came from a scene from the movie The Breakfast Club. I don't know how many of you are familiar with that movie, but it was my favorite movie when I was a teenager. And there's a scene where, so it's like five teenagers in detention at their school. And there's a scene where the like tough guy bully character played by Judd Nelson asks a series of questions to the like popular girl Molly Ringwald character. And he's asking her whether she's a virgin. And it's a really uncomfortable scene to watch. Like there's palpable tension in that scene. And eventually she reveals that yes, she is, and she's sort of shamed for it by the group. And I thought that that scene had such an interesting tension that I wanted to use that technique and write my own version of it. So a scene of escalating questions, but one where what's revealed is something much worse, and where it's something that also makes the person asking and everyone else in the room feel awful and culpable. And I also knew that like I couldn't end the story right there. Like earlier I mentioned like how short stories can end like with a truncated arc, but I thought that would feel like inappropriately abrupt for this story given what Eunice reveals. So I added like a little bit of falling action. And I thought of this narrative as having the shape of a piece of music where it like crescendos, has a climactic moment, and then kind of fades out. So that's the general structure of that story. And I did want it to have that lump in the throat ending.
Yeah, it's like it's so memorable. I think like people still talk about it.
Oh, thanks.
We think about that, right? Because it's really hard to do to create that amount of tension, right, in such a short work.
Oh, thanks. Yeah. And I think it's fun sometimes to like look at a model of something like in a movie or book or whatever that works really well and think about like what are the components and how can I do my own version of this. I like creating mini writing exercises for myself like that.
That's such a great idea. Like using your favorite scene from a movie and trying to transpose it into a book. I'm gonna try that. Uh, yeah, so we talked a bit about you were talking a bit about audience. My next question was about, should we think about audience, right?
Hmm.
I guess I'll jump ahead and go to publication because that's something that, a lot of
Sure.
students want to do, but they're not sure. So how do we go about publishing a short story and how do you know if you're ready to submit? I know you're editor-in-chief at Event Magazine. So how do you go about, reading for submissions and accepting a story? And what is an automatic rejection for you?
Yeah, so for submitting short stories for publication, um, it basically you just go to the magazine's website and follow their guidelines meticulously. So sticking to things like word count, also making sure to read the magazine or like a couple of issues, or sometimes they have samples of the work online to see if what you're submitting is a fit. So I think that part is pretty straightforward, and you can find calls for submission on like social media if you follow the magazines, or there are like writers markets where they'll have listings. I think the harder question is like, how do you know when a story is ready to submit? For me, it's just like once the story is at a point where I know I can't make it any better, and that's in terms of both like the structure and content of the story, but also in terms of like on the sentence level, like just like style and proofreading and all of the editing that I can put into it myself. I think it would be a mistake to assume that they're going to edit it for you, because most, especially magazines, don't have those kinds of resources. Um, and then you had asked about, oh, like, so the process of accepting stories at event. So we have, like, for fiction submissions, we have 3 rounds of reading. First readers will go through everything, and then they'll take all the yeses and maybes and put them forward to our fiction editor. And then she'll choose from those batches of stories to put towards the fiction committee. Our fiction committee is 4 people, and we have these meetings where we'll talk about 4 or 5 stories, and we all come prepared to like give comments for each story and also to vote. And we vote strong publish, weak publish, strong reject, weak reject. And then there are a couple of like rare categories. One is I would fight for this story, and I always like, I'm like, oh, I hope someone would fight for my story. And then the other one, which I've only used once in like 9 years at working at the magazine, is over my dead body. Like no way would we publish this story. Yeah, and then we usually have some debate and we'll vote and discuss further sometimes. But I think usually we kind of are able to come to a consensus. For automatic rejections, I think like a big one that happens often is just like flat prose, like feeling that like there's no real intention behind the writing. Sloppiness, like if there are lots of issues at the sentence level, it's usually an indication that there are bigger issues too. And then one personal pet peeve I have is like stories that are moralizing, like they feel preachy or like they have really black and white moral lessons where it feels like the author is condescending to the reader. For me, those are the automatic rejects.
That's good to know. It's like it's a very like competitive process. And how many stories do you get a year at event?
Yeah, so we cap our submissions because otherwise it would just be too many for us to keep on top of. We're open 4 months a year, and each of those times we take, I think it's 300 stories. So what is that, like 1,200 altogether, and we publish maybe like 12 in a
Wow.
year.
Yeah. So writing, it's a that's why all the rejection. You can still be very good and not get a single
Yeah.
acceptance, right? If it doesn't resonate with someone, right?
Oh yeah, we reject lots of stories that are good stories and just like didn't make it this time around or like weren't a fit with the other things that were in the issue.
Mhm. Good to know. Um, you mentioned when you edit, you go through, you do it as you rewrite your story until you can't edit anymore. When before you became a published writer, did you have writing groups or people who read your work before you submitted?
I did before I was published. Like, well, I guess when I was like a student in my MFA programs, I would have other people read my work and I workshopped everything. Now I don't though. I don't show anything to anyone until I send it to my agent or editor.
Yeah, it's interesting how the writing it shifts, right? It's like before
Yeah.
it's like a group thing where you rely on a lot of people to give you feedback, and then after a while it's just like one person, your agent.
Yeah.
Yeah.
After a while, I guess you kind of know your style and maybe have more like confidence in what you want to make it. And I think if I share it with people too early, it can be detrimental. Like it can mess with my process.
Mhm. Yeah. Interesting because we are always we always talk about that. I mean, in a writing program, it's always about the workshop. So,
Yeah,
mhm.
and I think workshop is helpful when you're like developing as a writer. You can learn a lot from it.
For
All my
sure.
classes are workshops.
Yeah. Mhm. So your next book is a short story collection. It's Death by a Thousand Cuts. It's
Hmm.
so brilliant. I was able to get an early advance copy, and it's coming in April. So can you tell us a little bit about the collection and your inspiration for writing it? And how was writing it different than The Most Precious Substance on Earth? Also, do you have
Yeah.
an arc with
I
you?
have my arc here. I
You
was
have your
just
arc.
reaching for it now. And thank
Yay.
you for reading it. Lindsay blurbed my book for me and was very generous with it. Yeah, so this is Death by a Thousand Cuts. It's 9 stories about I have to work on my elevator pitch for this. It's like the painful absurdities and everyday indignities that come with being a woman. So it explores themes like bodily autonomy and female rage, also like chronic illness and like bodily related themes. It's aiming for a darkly funny style. It's basically stories about the things I've been obsessing about for the past decade. And I'm really excited to have like a short story collection because like publishers, everyone wants a novel, and so that's why my past 2 books were novels, even if they were like covertly short stories or linked stories. So I'm excited. I think that changed the process a lot, is just writing these individual stories and shaping each one on their own, rather than having to think about like the spine of a larger narrative. Yeah, and it started with like it came together over a long period of time, and I started with 19 stories. Like the manuscript I sent my agent had 19 stories in it. And then we like culled it down. And then when I worked with my editor, we cut more stories and eventually just ended up with the 9 that felt the most like polished and cohesive. And that's when we figured out the theme too, that it was all kind of a women. But yeah, different working individually on stories rather than with a longer narrative.
Do you prefer it doing the I mean, I know you said you did, but like do you find it easier to change voices, or do you like staying with one voice for the whole of the whole book?
I think I really prefer the short stories because you can like feel like you're finished with it and then move on to the next one. And you can experiment with so many different things. Like a novel, you really have to commit to. Like I'm drafting a new novel now and I'm just like already bored with it and it's
Oh
the
no.
first draft. Whereas short stories, it's like, oh, here's this weird thing that I saw in the news that I want to write about, and you can just like work on it and finish it and then move on to something else that interests you. It's like, yeah,
Mhm.
less of a commitment, it feels like.
That's a good way of putting it, right? I'm commitment phobic, so I'm gonna write short stories. So I'm gonna tell
Yeah, totally.
people I don't want to write a novel. Um, and then there's some student questions about short story collections in general. Should they
Sure.
be linked in plot or can they be completely unrelated?
Yeah, they can be completely unrelated. Like my forthcoming collection, plot-wise, they're not related, but I think it's good to have something that connects them, whether it's theme or style or even something like setting, like something that makes it feel like this is a collection and there's a reason why these stories are being put together. Sometimes that might just be your own like author style, but they don't have to be connected in plot at all or character.
Mhm. Although publishers really like it when they're linked, right? So they're
Oh
always
yeah, because they can pretend it's a novel.
exactly right. Or even themes, they're kind of always like, I don't think so.
Yeah.
Yeah. And what are some strategies you use to return to the page when you're experiencing writer's block?
Yeah, a big one for the past few years has been I'm in these like, or I guess I organize these shut up and write groups just with other writers that I know, and I've done, Lindsay knows that I've done this, where we'll like meet with a bunch of writers at a cafe and we all just work at our own stuff, and we set a timer using the Pomodoro method. So you like write for 25 or 45 minutes and then you take a social break and then you write again and you just keep alternating for like 3 or 4 hours. For me, that's been huge for my productivity because if I'm like sitting with other writers and I hear them writing, I have a lot of pressure to write. Yeah, that's been the biggest one for me when I'm kind of stuck or like having trouble getting motivated.
Mhm. Yeah, those groups are so helpful. And I've done it in some of my classes where I timed them for like 30 minutes and
Oh,
I
nice.
state your attention and I think it's really helpful because there's no like 30 minutes, anyone can write for 30 minutes, right?
Yeah.
Instead of like going home and you're like, what do I do? I'll watch TV, I'll go for a walk.
Yeah. Being in a different environment can help with that too, like just less distraction.
Mhm. What are some good sites or resources to find literary journals? And does getting published help you get jobs or get longer works published?
Okay, so resources. There are a few, like I think I mentioned Poets and Writers earlier. I used to read the physical magazine, but they do have a really useful website and their whole classified section is free. And they have both, like I guess it might be worldwide, but at least North American, like places you can submit, also residencies and contests and all of that stuff. Um, I don't have like a link with me, but if you were even just to Google Canadian literary magazines, you would find like the National Magazine Awards Foundation has a list that would have links to all the different magazines' websites where you can read submission guidelines, check for submission windows, all of that stuff. A couple other resources. One is it's an email list called Literistic. I don't know how popular this is. I don't remember how I came across it, but you can subscribe, and every month they email you a list of deadlines. There's a free version and a paid version. What I did was I paid for it for a year, and I feel like a lot of those deadlines repeat at the same time every year. The free version is just a little bit shorter. Duotrope is another one that I think is pretty popular, and they have a free trial version, but it's just like a searchable database of writers' markets. Another one is just to like follow magazines on social media. Like most magazines will post if they have a contest or calls for submission. So like Twitter, even Instagram. Yeah, social media is good for that.
That's so helpful. Thank you. I didn't even know about that. And what what I usually do is I always look at bios of other authors. I'm like, oh, that sounds like a
Oh,
good
yeah.
magazine, right? And then I'll like make a note.
Yeah. Oh, and I didn't answer. I think the second part of your question was like, did short story publications help you get jobs? And I kind of laughed because it's so sad. Like, I guess if I'm thinking about teaching jobs, like teaching creative writing, you do need to be published in book form to get a job teaching creative writing, and usually it's a minimum of one or two book publications. But sadly, being published does not guarantee a job. Like there are many published writers who can't get teaching jobs, and that's just because there aren't that many of them. Like I had to move 6,000 kilometers for my current job. I moved to Vancouver from Halifax, so I think that's just the reality of that type of job. Publishing short stories in magazines can be really helpful to secure like a book contract. Like I wouldn't have a publishing career if it weren't for literary magazines. Um, I think once you're like, if you're querying agents, you include a little bio in your credits. And that's a place where you can list like these awesome magazines have published me. And it's just like proof that someone besides you thinks your writing is good. So there is value in publishing short work, even if your ultimate goal is to publish a novel.
Yeah, there's so many ways just getting your name out there, right? And
Mm,
having, an agent or editor take notice. Sure.
mm.
And yeah, I moved from Vancouver to Winnipeg. So you're right.
Yeah.
So you have to be willing to move, I think, if you want a career teaching creative writing. Based on the time, I'm just gonna quickly jump into the lightning round if that's
Oh, sure.
okay.
Yeah. Sounds
So
good.
feel free to answer any way you like or skip. So writing a short story is like fill in the blank.
It's like walking on a balance beam and then falling off at the end.
Oh no, that sounds really painful, like a really high one, right? Um, would you rather have to read your one-star Goodreads reviews every day and not be able to write for 2 years or go skydiving?
I would go skydiving. Yeah,
Okay, let's go. We're going
100%.
skydiving. Okay, next time I'm in
Oh no.
Vancouver, we're gonna go. Um, favorite writing snack or drink?
My answer's really boring. It would be coffee or tea because, like, if I had interesting snacks, I would not be writing. I would be focused on the snacks.
I'm always eating popcorn. I just get it all over my keyboard, like the cheesy stuff.
That's part of the creative process. Like,
I think so. Yeah, coffee too. Good. What are some books that you wish you had written, or something that you admire, or envy in other writers' styles or writing habits?
yeah, so there's one book that immediately came to mind, and it's Claire Keegan's Small Things Like These. It's like short and economical and subtle and just like devastating. Like I listened to the audiobook and I wept at the end, like while walking around town.
Okay, I'm gonna put that on my list. Now I have to listen to the audiobook. Okay. Three writers, dead or alive, that you would take with you on a 6-month residency on a tropical island and why?
Yeah, so I decided to limit this to like famous American writers because I didn't want to offend any Canadians by not taking them on a residency. Um, Two I was thinking of were Elif Bachman and Danielle Evans, partly because I just really like their work. They're both like they're smart and funny, and I would want to be friends with them. And I feel like if they were trapped with me for 6 months on an island, they probably would have to become my friend. The third one is George Saunders, partly again because I like his writing, but also I think he's so kind and lovely that he would prevent it from becoming Lord of the Flies.
You don't want to take me on the island. I'd probably eat everyone or
Yeah, you
write
would
about
totally eat
cannibalism.
me.
I know. Or I'd write about it.
Yeah, it's all material.
I know, right? Um, most embarrassing moment at a literary event. You can skip this one, but I want to know later.
Yeah, I don't know if I have. I couldn't think of like one big embarrassing moment, but it's more just like a constant feeling of embarrassment, especially at any type of literary event that involves mingling. Just like that anxiety of looking for the next person to talk to. Yeah, horrible.
But we talked in the bathroom. That's how we like first met. So
Yeah, I
yeah,
look for people who look as like nervous as
uncomfortable.
I do, pretty much.
Yeah. Mhm. And one piece of advice for aspiring writers.
Yeah, I always have the same advice, and it's just to write about the things that you're obsessed with and not the things that you're expected to write.
Mhm. That's really good advice. Yeah, I think about obsessions or things that you should not write about. That's what I
Oh,
tell
yeah.
people. Yeah, right. Because it's so often, we're told that write what you know, right? And that I think that creates like sort of like predictable stories.
Yeah, I think it's like write the weird things that you know. Like it doesn't have to be the super obvious things.
There's an ideal reader for everyone, I think,
Mm.
right? Even though sometimes a marketplace sometimes feels like they only want a certain type of story or a narrative. Mhm.
Yeah, I have a whole section on hair removal in my work in progress right now, which I don't think in high school I would have thought that would be material for a novel.
That sounds hilarious. I want to read it now. I'm so excited for it.
Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for taking the time and coming today. And we really learned a lot from you. So thank
Oh,
you.
thanks for having me. Yeah, this
It
was
was
such
so
an
fun.
honor.
I'll clap for Sashi.
Thank you. Oh, thanks.
So I'm going to stop the recording now.